Namaskar and very warm welcome to our viewers on Sansad TV. You are watching the World Panorama, where we take an in-depth look at major happenings across the globe during the week, from geopolitics, Russia-Ukraine war, environment and climate issues to business. I'm your host Rajiv Singh. Let us begin with the big stories of the week. Myanmar Election Commission dissolves political party led by ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Decks cleared for army-backed parties to grab power electorally. United States and Russia stop exchanging data on nuclear forces. Both countries push up the stakes on the nuclear threat hanging over the Ukraine conflict. United Kingdom adopts zero tolerance to anti-social behavior. Prime Minister Sunak unveils plan to speed up punishments to vandals and people who disturb peace. Amid unprecedented street protests and domestic unrest, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu shelves controversial judicial overhaul plan. And Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen arrives in New York. China reacts angrily, says potential meeting with US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy could lead to a serious confrontation. The army-appointed Election Commission of Myanmar dissolved the political party led by ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi. It said that Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy was one of 40 parties that failed to meet the Tuesday deadline for registration.
The army is holding on to power in Myanmar, and it has no intention of leaving. As a first step towards consolidating power in the country, it suspended 40 parties on Tuesday, claiming they had missed the deadline for registration. The intention is to free its proxies of the possibility of facing competition from any popular rivals whenever it chooses to hold elections. The junta had grabbed power in Myanmar on 1st of February 2021 by rebuffing the massive election victory of the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi in 2020. The NLD had defeated the United Solidarity and Development Party, a proxy of the army. On February 1st this year, the junta extended the emergency in Myanmar another 6 months, which will end on August 31st. Under the constitution, elections have to be held within 6 months after the end of the emergency, which would mean election could be conducted under military patronage by February 2024. To this end, new election rules were announced in January. Meanwhile, Suu Kyi's popularity has remained intact in Myanmar. Her party won more than 4/5 of the seats in parliament in 2020. The army has always feared that an absolute majority would allow Suu Kyi to overturn the army-drafted constitution to exclude it from politics. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
Amid safety concerns, the UN nuclear chief Rafael Grossi visited the Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant this week in an effort to avert the risk of an atomic accident. In the meantime, United States and Russia have stopped informing each other about missile tests, which can have an alarming effect on world security. Rafael Grossi, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog, was in Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station as part of efforts to avert a nuclear disaster. His visit came a day after the United States told Russia that it will stop exchanging data on its nuclear forces with Moscow. The White House was responding to Russian President Vladimir Putin suspending the country's participation in the New START treaty last month. Putin said Russia could not have US inspections on its nuclear sites at a time when Washington and its NATO allies have openly declared Moscow's defeat in Ukraine as their goal. Subsequently, Russia, however, said that it will continue to give the US advance notice about its missile tests in line with the 1988 US-Soviet agreement. The termination of information exchanges marked yet another attempt by the Kremlin to use Russia's massive nuclear arsenal to discourage the West from rampaging up support for Ukraine. Last weekend, Putin announced the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to the territory of Moscow's ally, Belarus. Under the New START treaty, parties involved exchanged data about the current state of the country's nuclear forces every 6 months. They also exchanged advance warnings about test launches and deployments of nuclear weapons. Such notices have been an essential element of strategic stability for decades. They have allowed Russia and the United States to correctly interpret each other's moves and make sure that neither country mistakes a test launch for a missile attack. Bureau Report, Sansad TV. Let us now take you to the Russia-Ukraine conflict zone and see through the developments on the war front during the week. Russia's defense ministry on Thursday released footage showing the launch of Soyuz 2.1V rocket from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in northwest Russia. In the accompanying text, it was said that Russia's aerospace forces launched the Soyuz 2 with a military space device in the interests of the Russian Defense Ministry, without specifying what the device was. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to visit his war-torn country. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has said it is up to the Chinese president if he wanted to meet Zelensky. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the Russian authorities highly appreciate China's balanced position and have no right to come up with any advice on whether the two should meet. Russia's Presidential Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, visited a Moscow-controlled part of eastern Ukraine for the first time since the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against her and Russian President Vladimir Putin for the abductions of children from Ukraine. Lvova-Belova visited children at a regional hospital and local care home. Ukrainian President Zelensky granted Okhterka in northeastern Sumy region the status of hero city for its resistance to the Russian invasion. Zelensky said the region is returning to normal life despite its location right at the border with Russia and in face of regular Russian shelling. The president claimed that Okhterka's successful repulsion of Russian forces helped save eastern and central Ukraine. A Russian court convicted a single father over social media posts criticizing the military operation in Ukraine and sentenced him to 2 years in prison. Alexei Moskilyov, who was indicted and tried in his hometown of Yefremov, has drawn international attention and is an indication that the Kremlin is intensifying its crackdown on dissent, handing out harsher punishments for any expression of criticism of the military operation. The case was brought to the attention of authorities by his daughter's school drawings against the fighting in Ukraine. Moskilyov has been detained in the Belarusian capital, Minsk, after fleeing house arrest in Russia. The United Kingdom is adopting a zero-tolerance approach to anti-social behaviour. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is unveiling a £160 million plan to stamp out anti-social behaviour once and for all. The plan involves more police patrols and swifter punishments for vandals and people who disturb peace.
Rishi Sunak's government is unveiling swifter justice measures and increased policing to deter low-level crime. Under the new rules, laughing gas will be banned, drug testing of criminals will be widened, and fines for graffiti will be increased. Youth centres will get more money to eradicate behaviour spoiling Britain's neighbourhoods. Immediate justice will involve antisocial elements to repair and clean up what they have damaged within 48 hours. Offenders will be made to pick up their litter, remove graffiti and wash police cars as punishment for antisocial actions. Victims of antisocial behaviour, on the other hand, will be given a say in how criminals are disciplined. There are also plans for hotspot policing or enhanced patrols in public transport, high streets and also in parks. Efforts are on to widen the range of trigger offences to include crimes linked to violence against women and girls, serious violence and antisocial behaviour. The measures will be rolled out across England and Wales from 2024. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
Let us now look at some more political news that gained traction during the week. Scottish nationalists selected Hamza Yusuf of Pakistani origin to be the country's next leader after a bitterly fought contest that exposed deep divisions in his party over policy. The 37-year-old succeeded Nicola Sturgeon as leader of the governing Scottish National Party and took over as head of the semi-autonomous government. Yusuf said he will concentrate on tackling the cost of living crisis and make a renewed push for independence. Yusuf takes over a party with an objective to end Scotland's 3 centuries-long union with England. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has defended his government's plans to detain children arriving in the UK on small boats, facing a Liaison committee that questions the Prime Minister on policy. Sunak spoke about the UK's plan to send migrants to Rwanda. He said the government was waiting for legal challenges to the policy to be completed and said he could not guarantee flights to Rwanda would begin by the summer. People in Kibera, a settlement in Nairobi, are rebuilding homes and businesses damaged in protests against Kenyan President William Ruto. Police fired tear gas and water cannons at stone-throwing supporters of opposition leader Raila Odinga. A church and several nearby businesses were set ablaze in Kibera, while a mosque was also damaged on Monday. The government and the opposition blame each other for the attacks. Close to 500 people took to the streets of San Salvador to demand freedom for relatives who, according to them, were unfairly jailed by the government's state of exception. This week marks 1 year since the beginning of the state of emergency declared by El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele as a strategy to confront gang violence. During the protests, demonstrators also demanded the end of the state of emergency. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said all illegal sanctions against Iran must be lifted, following a meeting with his Iranian counterpart in Moscow. Speaking at a joint news conference with Iranian Foreign Minister, Lavrov said the world is still waiting for the United States to return to its obligations under the nuclear deal. In the business capsule this week, we look at US President Joe Biden's remarks on Republican Party and Chinese economy, protests in France against pension reforms, China and the global supply chain, and inflation-related news from the UK.
US President Joe Biden says the Republican ideas for cutting the budget could undermine US manufacturing and help China dominate the world economy. Ahead of his face-off with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Biden is trying to shape opinion on whether the federal government should raise its legal borrowing capacity. The Biden administration is looking for a chance to lean into its battle with Republicans over spending priorities and who has better ideas to pilot the US economy in the years to come. Protests and strikes against pension reforms crippled France during the week. Hundreds of protesters took to the street in Nantes and Marseille. Hundreds of thousands have been taking part in a number of strikes and protests on the issue across France. The pension reforms include raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. China's Premier Li Qiang told foreign business executives, including smartphone maker Apple Inc. Tim Cook, that the country will open up further. Li met foreign executives at the China Development Forum in Beijing. China has set a modest annual growth target of 5% this year after significantly missing its target for 2022. Experts have cautioned that China still remains a key part of the global supply chain and more coordinated efforts should be made to ensure the global stability of industrial and supply chains. Speaking at the Boao Forum for Asia, that is BFA, they said that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tensions and challenges posed by climate change have exposed the fragility of the global supply chain. Many companies have rethought their operations. On the sky-touching inflation in UK, Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt said that the unexpected increase in inflation showed that there can be no complacency about rising prices. Defending central banks, he said that the central banks are under inflationary pressure and thus they are not overreacting. On US Inflation Reduction Act, Hunt announced that UK won't go toe-to-toe with US Multi-Dollar Inflation Reduction Act in distorted global subsidy rates.
Time for a short break in World Panorama. More coming up on the other side. Do stay with us. We are back in a moment. Welcome back in World Panorama. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu shelved a controversial judicial overhaul plan that set off unprecedented street protests and a spiraling domestic crisis. The controversy exposed deep-seated divisions in the nation, with political factions engaging in over 3 months of demonstrations against the overhaul plan.
Last 3 months, Israel has seen huge weekly protests against the government's plans to rehaul its judicial system. Thousands of people have been packing the streets calling for the reforms to be scrapped and for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to resign. Most significantly, military reservists, the backbone of Israel's armed forces, have been refusing to report for duty. Refusal to serve in the Israeli army reserves is viewed as shocking for Israelis. Netanyahu's opponents say that the reforms will severely undermine the country's democracy by weakening the judicial system. The reforms allegedly shield Netanyahu, who is currently on trial for alleged corruption, while removing checks on the government on passing laws. Further, the power of the courts is eroded, with the Supreme Court's power to review laws being severely curtailed. The Israeli parliament, with just a simple majority, can override the court's decision, while ministers can disregard advice of legal advisors. The new rules also allow the government to increase its representatives in the committee that appoints judge. The intensity of protests forced Netanyahu to halt the judicial reforms. In a nationwide announcement, he wished to allow dialogue and avoid a civil war. His statement came a day after one of the biggest protests in Israel's history, triggered after Netanyahu fired Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who called for a halt to the judicial overhaul. The protests highlighted the perception that Netanyahu willingly jeopardized the country's military readiness for his own political ends. For now, political groups are adamant that their protests will continue till they achieve their demands. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
China has threatened to resolutely fight back a potential meeting between Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen and U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in New York. The U.S. said China should not use Tsai's transit in the U.S. as a pretext to step up any activity around the Taiwan Strait.
Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen arrived in New York to criticism from China on Wednesday. Tsai is transiting through the US on her way to Central America, but may meet with US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy on a return leg. China has said such a meeting could lead to a serious confrontation. In response, the US had said Beijing should not overreact to Tsai's trip. This will be the 29th US transition by the sitting president in Taiwan since the first in 1994. In New York, Tsai was greeted by competing crowds of protesters and supporters outside her hotel. In response to her arrival in the US, China's envoy in Washington accused the US of advocating for Taiwan's independence by allowing Tsai to make a splash in the country. China has said that by allowing Tsai in the US, Washington has seriously undermined China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Tsai is scheduled to return to Taipei on 7th April. Tsai's visit to US comes in a week when Honduras announced that it is cutting off diplomatic ties with Taiwan and recognizing Beijing as the sole government representing China. Honduras was the 9th diplomatic ally that Taiwan has lost since Tsai Ing-wen assumed office in 2016. Taiwan now only has 13 diplomatic allies left. Earlier, former Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou visited China's city of Nanjing, the old capital when Ma's Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, ruled China in early part of the 20th century. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
In environment and climate-related news, we look at efforts to curb pollution in Australia, UN seeking ICJ ruling on climate change, Italy's plan to ban lab-grown meat, world switches off for Earth Hour, and wildfire in Spain.
Australia's biggest greenhouse gas polluters will now have to reduce their emissions or pay for carbon credits. New laws have been promulgated in the nation to curb pollution. These laws will take effect from July 1. The reforms create a ceiling on the nation's emissions and push Australia's 215 most polluting facilities to reduce their emissions by 4.9% a year or reach the target with carbon credits. The United Nations General Assembly has adopted a resolution seeking an International Court of Justice (ICJ) advisory opinion on what legal obligations nations are under to protect climate systems and people affected by climate change. The resolution was initiated by a South Pacific island state, Vanuatu, that is at a risk from climate change. Italy has approved a draft law to ban food and meat produced in laboratories. If the law gets final approval in Parliament, it would result in a complete ban on so-called synthetic food, both for humans and animals. The law will implement a complete ban of the production, sale, import and commercialization of food produced in laboratories. India and the world switched off the lights on several landmarks on Saturday to mark Earth Hour and encourage everyone to take accountability for their ecological footprint. Earth Hour, a worldwide movement organized by the World Wildlife Fund, encourages individuals, communities and businesses to turn off non-essential lights for an hour on the last Saturday of March. Millions of people in over 7,000 cities in 190 countries turned off their lights to show solidarity and commitment to saving the planet. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said that the climate emergency was already hitting his country this year as he visited an area of eastern Spain hit by wildfire in recent days. With Spain already enduring high temperatures and a lack of rain, firefighters were struggling to control a wildfire that reached over 9,900 acres and forced 1,700 people to leave their homes in the Valencia and Aragon regions.
Let us now look at our globe-trotting segment.
The Swiss watchmaking industry is thriving despite inflation and a looming global economic crisis. In Geneva, the Fashion Week of Watchmakers, Watches and Wonders is set to open its doors to the public with watches featuring reversible watch faces, recycled steel and price tags up to $4 million. All major luxury watch brands, including Swiss watchmaker Chopard, are in attendance. The brand set the goal of including 80% of recycled steel by the end of 2023. A group of men and women in the US state of Massachusetts knit and sew colorful blankets for immigrants coming to the United States. The initiative is intended to make immigrants feel welcome. It is part of the National Welcome Blanket Project, a crowdsourced artistic action supporting refugees settling in the US. To date, thousands of blankets and notes have been created for shows in Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles and Vermont. Lebanon's caretaker premier says the cabinet voted to move clocks 1 hour ahead on Wednesday night, reversing his decision to postpone and move to daylight savings time by a month that had sparked uproar across the country. Prime Minister Najib Mikati's decision was seen as an attempt to score points among Muslims who are fasting until sunset during the holy month of Ramadan. Triplets Ruby Rose, Peyton Jane, Portia May, who are now 2 years old, have entered into the Guinness Book of Records for being lightest and most premature triplets to survive until being toddlers. They are now world record breakers. The triplets were born very prematurely at just 22 weeks and 5 days. Javier Lopez, a Mexican children's comic, better known by his stage name Chabelo, died at 88. President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador informed. Lopez's best-known work, the Sunday variety show En Familia con Chabelo, ran for an astonishing 48 years from 1967 to 2015, Mexico's longest-running TV show. Lopez, who was no relation to the president, usually performed dressed in children's clothing well into his 80s.
That's all we have in World Panorama. Till we meet next time, keep watching Sansad TV for more news and informative programs. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.